In chapter 4, we return to Daniel after the story about his three friends in the previous chapter. Although Daniel is here, repeating his unique role in interpreting messages from God to the king, the story this time is not so much about him as about Nebuchadnezzar and his long journey to acknowledging God. The first 18 verses are from Nebuchadnezzar, switching to Daniel in verses 19 to 27, followed by some narration, which may or may not be Daniel, and then from verse 34 to the end, it is back to Nebuchadnezzar. I said in my video on chapter 2 that Daniel told the king that it was the God of heaven who had given Nebuchadnezzar his empire, and also that the idea that he was blessed by the divine realm would have been no surprise to him. But this doesn't mean that the king truly acknowledges this fact or really understands it. It is all too easy for us to pay lip service to the idea of God's provision and guidance, but in our hearts we remember how clever we were in a certain situation, or brave, or how a strategy we had been mulling over for months played out exactly as we had imagined it, and perhaps not for the first time. How many situations would Nebuchadnezzar have had to have got right in order to be master of the world? If he even had the slightest inclination towards humility and gratitude, his heart would continually present him the evidence of his own glory. The first few verses are introductory, an address by Nebuchadnezzar to the citizens of his empire, and a note of praise for the God Most High, who has worked signs and wonders for the king. We might think of a letter being sent round and copied, but what is more likely is that this would have been inscribed on a stele, a stone monument or pillar set up in a prominent location. What follows expresses Nebuchadnezzar's gratitude to this God, and remarkable humility in sharing this story, which involves him being painfully brought to heel. The story Nebuchadnezzar relates is similar in outline to that of chapter 2, only here the king does not add the dreadful clause about having to tell the dream before interpreting it. His usual people fail, and so Daniel is called in, who is here in verse 9 addressed as chief of the magicians. Nebuchadnezzar tells his audience that this one is endowed with the spirit of the holy gods, and so is not relying on books or other typical devices of this sort of prophecy. Instead, his power comes from a particularly special realm of the divine. In the dream, the king sees what is known as a world tree, a common symbol in the ancient Near East and elsewhere. We have seen one in Ezekiel 31 and also in chapter 17. The roots of the tree went into the underworld and drank the waters of the deep, whilst the top reached up into heaven, thereby binding all three layers of the world. Note that this tree stands at the centre of the earth in verse 10, which confirms that it is this symbol. So far, so good. But then a watcher descends from heaven and orders it cut down. Watchers are angels, seemingly a certain class or category. Angels were mainly just messengers, which is what angel means in both Hebrew and Greek. But the angel of the Lord, which we saw numerous times in our readings of the Old Testament, played a more active role, and sometimes could not be clearly distinguished from God himself. He wrestled with Jacob in Genesis, protected Israel as they left Egypt, opposed Balaam, and met David at the threshing floor. Watchers seem to have a more senior role, as they are described in other Jewish texts as those who do not sleep. In Psalm 121 verse 4, it is said of God that he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The idea is continual watchfulness for protection. The watchers were probably guardians. They were also identified in later Jewish writings as those sons of God who, in Genesis 6, went to the daughters of Eve and had children by them. That is what Jude is referring to in verse 6 of his letter. That these watchers are senior is indicated here by the command which the watcher gives to have the tree cut down, which is presumably obeyed by other angels. Indeed, in verse 17, it is called a decree of the watchers that this should happen, that all may know that the Most High is sovereign over all and gives power to whoever he wishes, regardless of their talent. We will encounter the archangels later in Daniel, called the chief princes. Michael is the chief prince of Israel, and they are involved in battles against the princes of other nations, such as Persia or Greece. This is the mysterious truth that human historical events have a spiritual reality behind them, that encourages believers that they are not left alone in the midst of chaotic world events, but that greater forces wage war on their behalf. On this occasion in Daniel, however, the emergence of this spiritual reality, represented by the Watcher, is to discipline the most powerful man on earth, by showing him that his world is inferior to another, and what he has was given him. Discipline is indeed the point, as though the tree is thoroughly reduced, the stump and roots are left for the possibility of regrowth. The imagery changes from tree to beast, and Nebuchadnezzar is condemned to a long period of some kind of total incapacity, until he learns who really is king and master of the world. How much does God care for Nebuchadnezzar? Sometimes he is spoken of as God's instrument, and particularly in Ezekiel, he is warmly spoken of. We remember he is given Egypt as a consolation for his troubles after the long and fruitless siege of the island fortress of Tyre. But the prophets also condemn this king, and Sheol awaits, as Isaiah says in a taunt song against him in chapter 14. Later rabbis were also perplexed at how much concern Daniel appears to have for Nebuchadnezzar, the one who destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. We do know from Jonah, however, that mercy can be extended to foreign enemies. Justice and mercy are complicated matters, to say the least, as the book of Job affirms. God's purposes are multiple and deep, and we do not understand the time scale on which they operate. But the main point of chapter 4 is not the well-being of Nebuchadnezzar, but the glory he gives to God in front of all the nations. The chapter ends, and so presumably the writing on the stele, with, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honour the King of heaven, for all his works are truth and his ways are justice, and he is able to bring low those who walk in pride." God allowed Pharaoh to oppress Israel for a time, that he might display his glory amongst them, decimating the gods of Egypt. He has used Babylon to bring about the judgment he warned through Moses, and before Babylon themselves will be judged for their crimes, he brings glory to himself once more by subjugating this supposed king of the world before all the nations.